The incident happened years back, in 2014 or 2015, when my fiance was, and still is, a well-known spoken word poet on Facebook, and got all kinds of contacts and fans through that specific medium. She went to places too, in and around Louisville, to speak her poetry and hosted shows on talk show. I'm an American male of Black, Irish, and Cherokee descent, born in Long Island, but raised in Florida since I was 12. She is Black American from Chicago. I was born in 74, and she was born in 79. We were together for 4 years, and are currently separated, but still communicating. Her life and her charismatic nature seems to be a magnet for weirdos, to say the least. Strange things often have happened when I was with her. Both odd, and at times, supernatural. There were many incidents and different stories I could tell, but this one is one of the strangest. She made a contact with a Facebook follower of her poetry page. He was Black American, very handsome and well-built in appearance, around our age. He looked like the actor who played Blackula back in the day, when he was in his normal human appearance, though they had been talking through Messenger app for a while. And even though my fiancé was very worldly wise, full of street smarts, and a great hustler, so to speak, as Chicago women can be, she is a baptized, believing Christian since she was 11 years old, and this guy said he was also a saved Christian. They talked, and over time, I guess he began to trust her and open up. I am not a jealous man, and knew that the life she was involved in automatically involved communications with all sorts of people, and besides, she was not the type to cheat. She always confided in me anything that was strange or unusual. Apparently, this guy was well off somehow. I don't remember what he did for a living exactly, but he and a close buddy of his traveled often. He said he went to somewhere in Asia, maybe near Tibet. I'm not exactly sure since the incident that occurred had been a while. Apparently, he found out a ritual from some Asian occultist of how to become a werewolf. He didn't say exactly what the ritual was, but it was very evil, involving human sacrifice and selling your soul. Apparently, he and his buddy decided to do this evil thing because they liked the idea of having that much power. Over time, the things he had done began to take over every aspect of his life. He killed and killed from time to time, but grew tired of it and felt he was losing control to the spiritual power that he gave himself over to. Over time, he decided he needed to do whatever was necessary to correct this mistake. He managed to find, after much searching, a deliverance pastor with knowledge of the reality of these things that occur in the occult, who would help him. He said he was delivered and later baptized by this man. But sometimes this darkness and pure wrath would start to fill him up at times, and he started to revert back into his evil beast ways, and prayer would stop it. My fiancé, taken aback by all this, was shocked, to say the least. She, of course, being normal-minded, thought he was nuts. She did not believe him, and made the mistake of even mocking him a little bit. He later sent a picture of himself and a short recording that scared the crap out of her. She showed it to me and let me listen, and it freaked me out. We were both in agreement, without taking just facial expression and body language, that she should cut all ties with that man. The picture showed him looking intently into the camera, with animalistic eyes that had a slight shine to them, like canines do. He looked so intently wrathful that if looks could kill, we'd all be dead. His right shoulder was shifted out of place, as though somebody had stretched it from his neck close to 6 inches. The muscles on that side looked swollen too, as if pumped up with steroids, while the left shoulder was somewhat normal. He had on just a tank top, so you could see his upper shoulders pretty good. And the only thing I could say is it looked like his body was in the process of starting to morph into something not normal. Then, I listened to the recording. It sounded like a cross of two things. Take a big, deep, guttural growling wolf sound and cross it with the deep voice of a man, and that is what he sounded like. He said, with the most severe disdain and hatred, "How dare you mock me? How dare you judge me? Don't you ever mock me." And my jaw dropped. I had no impression this was just a prank. There were photos too on his Facebook page that was suspect, in the way of being odd. His eyes, how he looked weightlifting, just different things that this guy said and did, is something so normal serious person is not to be messed with. Later on, I found a video on YouTube called Werewolves and Vampires, Real or Fake, and I learned more about that craziness that goes on in the occultic world. I found other channels like your channel, and found you later after that. And I've got to say that as a truck driver of 25 years, I'm glad, truly glad, I've never run into one of these things on the road late at night, and hope I never do, because at the rate of these accounts of seeing these things that are apparently going up and up and up in recent years, that means America has a serious infestation problem of these beasts, and it might become more common in the near future for many people in the country areas not to be able to go out at night, period, or camping anywhere else in state parks or forests, or lead to an exodus of people to more highly populated areas. Well, that's my story. I believe she had another encounter where she and a girlfriend of hers were at a club in the city, and these people talked to them into going to a private house party. When they got there were others who had weird predatorial eyes, and one claiming to be a vampire, and he wondered what their blood tasted like, in a supposedly sarcastic, joking fashion. They freaked out and ran to her car and sped away. All the while, a few of them were speed-walking fast behind them, with weird grins on their faces. Let's just say that my fiancé is really careful about where she goes out at night and the weekends, and who she is with after that incident. I could tell you more, but it's probably best I cut this email short, so I can be a riveting story for you, and not just a long book. Stay safe and be well. I really appreciate what you are doing to enlighten people about what is going on in our crazy and getting even crazier world that we live in. Well, I'm a huge fan of your channel, so I wanted to send this to you. Do with it what you want. I thought you would like to know what I came across after a walk and taking photos, just off a pretty regular traveled bike trail. I had known about the Bigfoot as I seen one as a young girl hiking in the mountains here in the Northeast, but I had no idea until now that Bigfoot and Dogman do hang in packs as in the wild wolf packs or others. I guess I can call myself a witness or researcher and have been studying Bigfoot for most of my life now. I have many stories to send, but I'm not really a good storyteller. Let's just start with this one. I live in the Northeast. I was just out for a walk into my little favorite spot off the biking trail. It has a stream for fishing, and I had been going there to fish and to just hang in the woods. This time, I was just checking it out and took a path off the blacktop park that the bike trail is at, into where the fishing spot is. I didn't smell anything, but I did notice no birds or movement in the woods. This had me on high alert, 'cause I had a bear stalk me in another area, not far away from this spot. So anyway, I had a feeling just to stop walking on this trail and take a few pictures and leave. Did just that, and went home after getting home. I was scanning my pictures and got rid of bad ones and scanned the ones I like. In one picture, I could see something but didn't know, so I put the SD card in my laptop to view the larger screen. Well, what was standing just a foot off the trail, behind a small tree with most leaves gone, due to it getting late into fall, was a Dogman holding a baby Bigfoot. I was just standing less than 20 feet from it when I took the picture. Sure glad I didn't go any further up that trail. I believe it's a game trail due to the fact I seen the black bear there too. I guess they hang together in packs and are in family units. I stopped going into that area so much because, first, I knew Bigfoot was there. I've seen it. But that's just one of many stories I have. Thank you for all your stories. I do enjoy them, and am happy you are bringing awareness to people. It needs to be done. These things are running amok, literally. Especially when you just walk off a well-traveled bike trail where kids are playing and riding bikes. They are not in the deep woods anymore. They are literally in our backyards. This scares me the most. People are walking around with a false sense of security. They truly have no idea what awaits them. I hung out at night, walking the roads with friends, looking for a party or group to get together with. Never ran across a Dogman. Now, I don't go out at night, and days I stay close to the busy city. Thank you. Hi. I wrote to you before about my own experiences in 2015 with an upright canine creature in upstate New York. I want to thank you for sharing my story and also update you on what's been going on. As you might remember, I moved since the encounter I had. It was where my neighbor, Mr. McNeil, had been followed as he rode up into the mountains. I saw the creature from the tree line, and I'll never forget it. Now, I'd like to tell you about what my buddy has witnessed since I left New York. You might remember how I mentioned a neighbor's hunting dogs being torn to shreds. Since then, chickens and pets have been attacked or gone missing. Let me start with the year following my move. My buddy, Thomas, told me that 2 chicken enclosures had been broken into and several chickens taken. I'd chalk it up to wildlife, but the chicken wire fences were literally pressed down into the ground so hard it left prints. Local wildlife does not do that. To further my beliefs, the second neighbor this happened to saw what got into her chickens. She's an elderly lady, Mrs. Weiss, a kind old lady who's been there forever. She told Thomas it was a huge, dark creature with a snout. It dug a hen out of the coop and squatted down. It had the chicken in its grasp, rotating it like corn on the cob as it bit down. She closed her curtains, going upstairs, horrified by what she saw. By midwinter, the cops now were making regular rounds and going back and forth throughout the night for several weeks. Thomas told me that Mr. McNeil's place was dead quiet. He had figured the old guy closed up and left. This was in the winter of 2018. The Catskills were dead still. No tracks, no animal activity whatsoever. At least our portion of it. Then, in January of 2019, Thomas told me that he was out in the woods when he heard the deepest, most resonant howl he has ever heard in his life. He, quote-unquote, ran like hell for at least 5 miles, he says, until he collapsed in his garage, so full of adrenaline that he said he did not even feel his legs under him. For the rest of winter, he and his family heard low howls in the night. This is very uncommon for that area. Last time we talked, he seemed okay. Not too much has happened this year. It does seem to pick up in late December or in January, especially when there's a cold spell. I'll update you more if anything significant happens. I would like to tell you about the single most terrifying thing that I have ever experienced as a rookie cop. In fact, this messed me up so much that I left the force soon after. I just couldn't cope afterwards. I won't give any specifics such as where this happened, or an exact date. Even though I'm no longer in the job, there could still be repercussions somehow. God knows the nightmares shall be punishment enough. It started off as a regular call from dispatch. Neighbor had called in, saying that she had heard a commotion in the yard next door, and the sound of smashing glass. It was roughly 2 a.m, and had been loud enough to wake her up. She hadn't seen anything, but thought that she had heard a dog barking, which she'd also found weird, since the neighbor she was reporting about did not have a pet. We were treating it as a possible break-in, since the neighbor said the woman lived alone, so a domestic disturbance was likely. As usual, we were short on officers available for backup, with there already having been a shooting that evening that had been taken out most of the shift, as they dealt with multiple perpetrators and witnesses. So it was just me and my partner. These kind of calls weren't unusual, but since I was still kinda new, they always kept the adrenaline pumping. I'd only been in the job a couple of years, and I'd already seen 2 colleagues buried. We turned off the lights and sirens as we approached the property. My partner, whom we'll call him Joe, went to the front door. I headed to the back. Thankfully, there was a porch light on, so the yard was lit well. The neighbor who had called it in had mentioned hearing a commotion. There was trash everywhere. It appeared like whoever had broken in had first emptied out all the garbage cans and spread them all over the floor. Mindless destruction. Or had they been looking for something? It was hard to tell. There was indeed a smashed window there. Usually, if somebody smashes a window, it's in order to reach through to an open door. I mean, anyone who watches a movie knows that. But this was a full window taken out, and it looked like whoever had gone through it had done so in a hurry, as there was blood on the remaining glass and what looked to be fur. I remember dispatch had mentioned a possible dog at the scene, but not belonging to the owner of the property. It seemed weird. Perps don't usually bring Shep for walkies when casing a joint. Anyway, I push the door and it opens. I radio to Joe that I'm going in and will open the front door for him. As I check the kitchen where the broken window is, there is now a trail of blood going all the way through the house. My gun is out, and I'm checking each room as I go through. But nothing. I let Joe in, and we head up the stairs. seeing more blood as we go too. Now, it would be exactly a surprise if I said that I had a really bad feeling about this. Not that any call that involves trails of blood ends well, but there was an extra feeling that something was very, very wrong. I will admit, I was scared. The closer we got to the bedroom, the more intense this feeling grew, and I would even go so far as to saying that I could sense evil in that house. Now, maybe that in hindsight, me looking back and adding memories of feelings, I can't say for sure, but I can tell you that what we found when we opened the bedroom door was the absolute epitome of evil. But just before we opened the door, we stood quietly outside it and listened, just for a second or two, to see if we could glean any extra information about where the perp might be in the room. We could hear what sounded like two people in there. Two distinct sets of noises. One, we assumed was the female of the property, and it sounded like the poor woman was whimpering. But she was still able to make a noise and therefore be alive, which was a good sign. The second noise was more unusual, as it sounded like a heavy pant and a low growl. Now, we knew there had been a report of a dog being heard, but why couldn't we hear the second person? We busted to the door, guns out and ready, but I don't think we could have ever actually been ready for what we saw. I know for sure that I will never forget it. There was a lot of blood to start with, and we weren't sure who it all belonged to. The woman was lying on the bed. The covers had been thrown off. They were piled in a heap on the floor. She was wearing a nightie, which had been pushed up, exposing her legs and panties. They were covered in blood. There was a large wound on one of her legs, near to her ankle, and it looked, God help her, like a bite mark. The sight of the blood wasn't the most shocking thing about her. It was the look of terror upon her face, and then we saw why. I had rushed to the woman, while Joe had remained by the door, and now the perp appeared from behind it. I will just straight out tell you exactly what it was. A Dogman. Let me describe this thing for you. I won't ever forget what he looked like, since I see him every night in my dreams. I would guess around 6'5", very well built, strong as an ox, as my Nona would have said. Despite being covered in a dark brown, rough-looking hair, you could see its muscles rippling through, like it went to the gym. Think The Rock, but with fur. He wore no clothing, but the hair was all over, even on his face. He was bipedal, stood tall and proud, not like a dog who was begging, but like he was meant to be on his two legs. His arms and legs were in proportion to his torso, although the arms seemed to hang a little lower than a human's would. At the end of the powerful-looking legs were large feet, each with a large curled claw, kind of like a talon, and at the end of each long arm was a huge paw, again with razor-sharp looking claws. That all led up to the head. If the body of this abomination was meant to resemble man by its shape, the head was 100% dog. I could have been looking into the face of one of our canine units. It was German Shepherd for sure, which may be some wolf thrown in. The small pointy ears were pressed down, the long black snout dripping. Small black eyes stared right at me, and the mouth was open. Curled lips and a snarl to show a very dangerous set of teeth. There was now fresh blood all around the maw, and that was when I also noticed more blood matting the hair on one side of its body. That must have been the blood trail that we had followed from the broken window. Now, I don't know about you, but when I watch a horror movie, and the hero doesn't bat any eye when they see the vampire, or creature, or werewolf, or monster, just instinctively somehow knows what to do to kill them. I always thought to myself, if I met a monster in real life, I'd probably soil myself and run away, or be completely frozen in fear. It's one thing to go onto autopilot and use your training when you're faced with a human, but there are no lessons at the academy about what to do when you meet a non-human foe. Suddenly, it leapt at me, and then I heard a bang. There was a flash, a howl, and a crash. Joe had managed to do one better than me, and had come out of his shocked stupor when the thing made to attack me and shot it. It had hit the beast, and then smashed through the upstairs window into the garden below. In the few seconds it took to look out, it was gone. There was a load more blood and hair in the rosebush below the window where it had landed, but it was now gone. Training kicked in, and then we dealt with the victim, stemming the blood flow on her leg until the EMTs arrived. The poor woman was absolutely traumatized, as you would expect. Thankfully, it had only been a physical attack, and I say only knowing full well just how traumatic the entire thing was. Believe me, if it had gone from sniffing to worse. Anyway, she was patched up and allowed to go home. By then, I had already had the talk with the brass, told to change the statements, and told the party line was to be a human, messed up on PCP, had broken in looking for cash. There was no such Dogman. It wasn't long after that I left. And do you know the absolute worst thing about the entire story? People know about this, and it's being covered up. These creatures, these predators are real, and nobody, for whatever reason, is allowed to talk about it. I am a hunter. I've been hunting for years. I would consider myself experienced, but considerate. I keep to the seasons, abide by the rules and laws, and always safety first. I enjoy the thrill of the kill, but I also hunt for food. If I shot a deer, I bring it home and feed the entire family. I'm telling you all this to let you know that I'm not some sort of gun-toting crazy that goes out killing for the sake of it. I've also been doing it for a long time. I'm well into my 50s now, and began going out with my father when I was just a young teen. Again, this is just to let you know that I have seen many things, as you can imagine, out in the woods. That when I came across the animal I'm about to tell you about, I was confused, and I wasn't mistaken. It was turkey season, so I was out early, hoping to catch a big tom. I was looking to find somewhere to bunker down. It was around 5 in the morning or so, a touch of mist, and still quite dark. There was a profound dampness in the air. Since I'd been in the woods many times, I knew the exact place I wanted to make a sort of base. I headed over to the spot that I had used many times, as it had awesome coverage, with the trees, and a sort of dip in the ground, which seemed to almost be ready to be lie and waiting in. But, as I headed over, I was certain that I was in the right spot. Something felt off. Call it a gut feeling. Some sort of hunter's intuition, if you will. I can read a situation which has come in mighty handy many times before, and kept me out of a couple of tight scrapes. And that's what I felt now. That something wasn't right. As I said, it was still pretty dark, since it was early dawn, and I was more feeling my way from memory than actually being guided by any sort of light. I don't take a flash or nothing with me, so I hadn't seen what had decided to make me usual spot in my home, until I came closer than I would have if I had known. Thankfully, I heard before I saw, and what I heard made all the hairs on the back of my neck stand straight up. Dogs. I could tell it was dogs from the low growl, whining and yapping, and those sounds were the most alarming, as they seemed to be coming from a pub. Now, anyone knows that the worst kind of animal to encounter is a mama. They will do anything to protect their offspring, and quite rightly so. I wasn't sure why there would be a pack of feral dogs in the woods. I had never seen anything like them in there before, but I did not want to hang about. I was just about to try and sneak off when my cell phone began to vibrate. To say I was angry was an understatement. I always turn it off entirely before a hunt. Still, at least, it wasn't blurring out AC/DC. Maybe the vibration alone wouldn't attract any unwanted attention. But of course it did. Again, I heard it before I saw it. That growling noise. Only there seemed to be something very, very wrong. I stood up. I'm over 6 feet tall. That sound should have been coming from at the very most around the top of my leg area. Yet it seemed like it was coming from right beside me. And in fact, I could swear that I could feel hot breath on the back of my neck. My first instinct was to run. But I also know that sometimes running away makes whatever is behind you give chase. I needed to turn to face this thing and show some human dominance. Yeah, right. But that's what was going through my mind. That and total blind panic. As I slowly turned, I came face to face with what I assume was the mama dog. Only she wasn't dog-sized. She was not wolf-sized. She was people-size. A huge she-dog, as big as me. Not like an actual hound on 4 legs that just happened to be massive. This thing was standing on 2 legs, looking me right in the eye. She was built like a pro wrestler, covered in a thick reddish-brown fur. Her head reminiscent of that of a Doberman, with those tight, mean-looking features. Her teeth were bared, and every tooth, unlike that of a regular dog, was pinpoint tack sharp. Before I could even turn away, I wanted to run. I was scared out of my mind. I didn't even bother to draw my weapon, head out at her, try anything to defend myself. I was that frightened, right then, that I honestly thought she was going to kill me, and I just wanted it to be quick and as pain-free as possible. Yes, my life flashed before my eyes right there and then. Then, there was another sound. A tiny yip, a yelping noise. It was the pup, and it seemed to be gravitating towards its mother. The tiny pup, who when I got a quick look, was actually the size of a small boy. Saved my life, as Mama seemed to think whatever the pup needed was more important than me, right at that moment. She quickly made her way back over to the nest. I ran. I was no longer worried about whether she would give chase. I just hedged my bets, and she was more protective than aggressive, and wanted me away from her offspring, rather than to eat me. Thank the Lord that bet paid off, and I'm alive to tell you this story. I haven't been back to that spot. I don't necessarily have faith that it was a death wish, but I also have never told anybody about it. I try to be a sensible hunter. I have plenty of friends who would kill anything and everything they come across. They just like the killing part, and like to prove that they as men are on top of the food chain, the main predator on this planet. They'd be dumb to go out shooting lions and tigers. So if they knew about those creatures. I know that mama dog person was aggressive. I was sure, 100% sure that I had it. But she was being protective. You don't mess with moms. Those other hunters, though, they'd kill her and the baby. Wouldn't think nothing of it. Just carry the bodies out and parade them around to share all over the internet. I might have been more scared than I hope I'll ever be again, but I'm not cruel. The other thing is, if that was a baby and a mama, there must have been a dad. And if Mrs. Dogman was that big, what in the name is Mr. Daddy Dogman like? I was one of the Marines that had toured in Afghanistan the longest. It wasn't because I wanted to be there. It was because I was the one of the best in a firefight. I could keep my weapons hot and my head cool. When you're on the outside of the armed forces looking in, you see the medals you get when you survive through one disaster after another. When you're on the inside, you know that the real reward for surviving is going on missions with a slimmer chance of survival. Everyone else just dies faster. We were being dropped by a helicopter into an undisclosed location. I thought I had a pretty good grasp on the geography of the area, but looking down, I had no landmarks to properly guide me. It was wide open wilderness, like the underworld of some bad children's story. Our parameters were to gather whatever intel we could and neutralize any threats. That was by far the most vague and open-ended mission parameters that I've ever heard in my entire career. Who were the innocents? Were there any hostages? Were there any confirmed hostiles? Were we investigating to see if there were any hostiles? No such details were forthcoming. The last thing they told us was that we had an hour, and after that, they were leaving us there if we didn't come back out. That made me wonder if something had already been encountered at that location that nobody just came back from. But you didn't ask those questions out loud. We were kicked out in front of a caravan, set into a very spiky-looking mound of rock. It looked more and more like something from a bad story. I took point, and we turned on our light and plunged into the cave. It was remarkable how much cooler it was inside that cave than outside. It made me feel like I could breathe a little easier, but I still had to keep my wits about me. The first 5 minutes of crawling around in there had sold me on the idea that there were no people inhabiting the cave. The odd bone or two might have been left by some desert scavengers looking for shelter from the sun, but no people. I changed my mind in a hurry when we passed through a narrow opening into a room that was rank with the aroma of iron. Dark stains painted the walls all around and the ground. The horror show had officially begun. One thing led to another. Skulls with wooden stakes driven through them. Slabs of wood with rotting bodies stretched out and impaled with more wooden stakes, and whatever else could be used in a similar fashion. We were so caught up with the cascade of grisly revelations that we lost our focus long enough for a hostile to leap out of some shadowy hiding place and let loose a volley of bullets. Most of the shots missed. 2 found my armor and were safely buffeted. He wasn't wearing anything more protective than a cloth robe, and my retaliatory shot found his head. He joined the rest of the head wounds littering the chamber. The surprise attack had shaken us, and we were eyes up from that moment on. The intensity of that first room was just the beginning. Mutilated bodies became a common part of the decor. There was one small chamber where the floor was completely eclipsed by human remains. What kind of information was the CO wanting? I don't even think he knew. The answer was probably in an office somewhere. I've seen enough Indiana Jones movies that I should have been able to avoid what happened next. I guess I just didn't expect to see anything like it outside the movies. We stepped into yet another chamber that had a high ceiling. This is the part where we got really nervous. There were sounds in that chamber, animal noises that I could not place, and I don't think my men could either. There were some that sounded like wild boars, others like lions. There was a lot that just did not match up with anything, and that's when I stepped forward and hit a tripwire. A heavy wooden gate slid down, sealing us in. It must have been on some kind of pulley system, because another gate opened as soon as that one came down. We trained our lights on the black opening. All the animal noises seemed to be coming from there. We were not prepared for the speed with which anything would burst out of the doorway. We were half a second too slow on the trigger. When my bullets had struck the doorway, someone was already on top of one of my men. The seconds that followed, with me retraining my aim and firing, began to slow down. I saw the shape that had tackled my fellow soldier. It wasn't human. It was superhuman. Huge, muscular. Everything about it was taut with aggression. Its furry arms dealt one haymaker after another, with blinding force and speed. I unloaded into the side of its ribs, shoulder and head. It landed on its back, stone dead, part of its hairy skull blown open. From the neck up, it looked like a very rugged German shepherd that had been in plenty of fights. From the neck down, it looked like a steroid-charged killing machine. All humanoid features, just very furry. I turned the light to my fallen soldier. His neck had been broken, and his face was peeled off. More grunts approached the opening of what was left, and we got ready. The gunfire created strobe lights in the cavern, and each flare was a snapshot of teeth and claws, and eyes that burned with a glow. There were at least 4 of them. I dropped 2 of them with volleys straight to the head. Shooting them in the chest didn't seem to do much, and a sickening cracking sound drew me over to see that one of them had breached a soldier's chest and was tearing into his ribcage. My light caught the movement of his lungs before clawed hands tore them out. It explained why I didn't hear him scream. The back of the monster soaked up nearly half of a magazine before it fell over. I shouted to whoever was left to get the exit unblocked. That maneuver cost us 3 more lives, as those 3 soldiers used themselves as shields to protect the Marine that broke the supports, keeping the barrier in place. 3 of us made it out. The people that orchestrated the operation wanted to know if we had completely taken care of all the hostiles. We weren't sure. They marked it as a mission failure, and all of us were discharged. I was able to connect with someone out of pure chance who had been sent on a similar suicide mission to the exact same region. Just a different cavern. If you've ever experienced anything like this, please reach out to me. We need to talk. I saw my men torn apart, with nothing but claws and fingers, from beings that looked like the Egyptian Anubis. I want to know why they were fed to these things, like cans of tuna. And I'll be vetting you when you contact me, just to make sure. I think you'll understand. Thank you for taking the time to read this. I will be arrested for sure if I tell you who I am and where this took place. So I'm just going to tell you that I'm part of a cleanup crew, hired to take care of the aftermath of one of the recent protests that turned violent on government property. No, I'm not referring to the Capitol building. That's not the first place that violence came to visit the suits and ties of American politics. It just hasn't been publicized as widely. The number of offices were trashed really good before police can turn the tide with their batons and tear gas. You don't realize just how much paper there is in government buildings until you have to clean it up. Desks were overturned. Filing cabinets were kicked over. Drawers were piled up and dumped out, looking like a war zone. This wasn't like past projects, cleaning up government property. For whatever reason, they wanted all papers and all other forms of storage of information destroyed. If we did a thorough job, we got triple the pay. If we leaked anything we found, there was a chance we could face a lifetime of imprisonment. So, we approached the job with compliant attitudes. It did confuse me as to why you'd keep such sensitive info in a place where the public was more or less free to come and go. But it also made sense to hide some things in plain sight, where people will never look for them. True to our assignment, every last paper, flash drive, disk, current and obsolete form of digital storage, and binder had been rounded up and shipped off to be incinerated. I was part of the final walkthrough that would make sure that nothing had been overlooked. We split up and did a once-over all the floors. Fallen behind a shelf on a sub-level was a single VHS tape. It was the only VHS tape that I had seen in the building. That was the only moment that I questioned if it would be worth risk of going to prison for the rest of my life. I kept it. I managed to smuggle it out of the building, and nobody caught me. My expectations for the tape were low. It would surely just be some personal project of some inventory, manifest-related material. The first 10 minutes were of the camera sitting on a table, filming an empty cage of sort. It was all metal, and the bars seemed or appeared to be very heavy. There were a host of locking mechanisms and levers, even gears. I think I saw buckles and straps, which made no sense. Then the film cut to a separate segment where the cage was occupied. Whatever it was crammed inside the cage, and it was not happy about it. It had no room to stand up or to sit down. The cage may as well have been an animal's coffin. I wanted to think it was some sort of gorilla, but even gorillas don't get that big. And gorillas also don't make sounds that fear-inspiring. The grainy quality of the tape made it impossible to pick out details of the black shape in the cage. Another jump cut to a small room, rectangular in shape with no windows and no visible doors. A hard-looking man, quite possibly a convict, was looking around, with a very confused expression on his face. Tattooed from head to toe, he muttered something in Spanish. He moved across all the walls as if probing for an exit. Apparently, he was not made aware there was a camera. A handwritten title screen appeared that said Training 03A. The camera cut back to the convict, but there was a lot of action taking place. He was up against the wall shouting, rambling. A black shape came up to him and towered over him. It was muscular and furry, like someone in a Halloween costume. The thing made a motion, as if slapping the man across the cheek. His cheek was sliced to ribbons, and the interior of his mouth was exposed. His tongue squirmed as he shrieked in pain, and painted the floor with blood. The more the shape tore the man apart, the more it dawned on me that it wasn't somebody in a costume. This hulking creature was slowly tearing the man apart, flesh to bone, and it seemed to relish the experience. For the short time the man had lips, I think I heard him saying a prayer. Then, his face was no more. The animal studied his flesh as if studying it. It didn't like the sounds the man made, so it forced its paw down on the unprotected throat. You could see it being shredded. The video cut to another human prisoner, this time a woman. She was also butchered in a similar fashion. The being or creature was facing the camera, more in that one, and it looked everything like you'd expect a werewolf to look like. I so wanted it to be a costume, but that fakeness you expect from a mask wasn't there. Everything was just so alive and moving, brimming with intelligence of a predatory killer. There were twitches and ticks that could not be simulated by a costume. The woman's death was not slow. There was much more on the tape, but I could not watch. I mentally reviewed every square inch of the government building, and couldn't recall anything that hinted at the presence of such thing. There may have been a sublevel, possibly. And that left me where I was before that I decided to ever submit this story. What do you do when you know something like this has happened? I can't show the tape for obvious reasons, and I don't dare identify myself. Who would put together such awful things? If that was indeed the work of the U.S. government, what were they trying to accomplish? My Uncle Brown talked me into going hunting with him. Not the worst thing in the world, except my uncle was prone to drinking when out hunting. His chances of hitting a clear target were reduced exponentially, and his odds of hitting something he shouldn't went up by just as much. He told me that he wouldn't drink on that particular outing, but he cracked a beer as soon as we got out into the woods, and said that he meant he wouldn't start drinking right away. So I hoped that the stink of beer would keep us from seeing any deer, so the world would be safe from my uncle's shooting. No such luck. There came a doe that was worthy of a magazine shoot. My uncle took a shot, and it was too sloppy. I don't even know where the shot went, but it did not hit the deer. He swore up a storm, with slurred words, and got himself yet another beer. I would have left him there, but the ride out there was his, and I shouldn't let him drive home in that condition. For whatever reason, my uncle took an interest in a fat squirrel that was leaping from tree to tree. It was the most embarrassing expenditure of ammunition I had ever seen. The squirrel practically barked in protest, but I think my uncle interpreted it as laughter, so he was that much more determined to shoot a hole in that thing. He shot holes in lots of things, just not in the squirrel. This led to him having another fit and swearing and throwing down his rifle. He was about to stomp on it, but he lost his balance and he fell over to the side. We went for a short stroll and stopped at the top of a hill. My uncle indicated some animal of interest at the bottom of the hill. He summarized that it was a bear. I couldn't tell. It was big enough to be a bear, but there was a lot of underbrush and plants blocking my full view. He took yet another careless shot. Any other time he would have missed, but a yelp told me that the shot had landed true. I don't know that I'd ever seen an animal move so quickly. Whatever that was, it went flying up the side of the hill at my uncle, and I took the hint that it would be a great idea if I didn't just stand there and take it all in. Something like a wolf that walks on two legs did a dolphin dive up into the air, coming down on my uncle. I landed the luckiest shot of my life with my own rifle. Blew one of its eyes, and it collapsed on top of the flailing drunk. He had a huge chunk bitten out of his shoulder, and it called for a trip to the ER. He wouldn't shut up about making sure nobody else bothered the corpse of the dog monster, but I was more worried about making sure he wasn't going to bleed out. Plus, I didn't fancy hunting with him a second longer than necessary. We got him all patched up, and he was itching to get back out to where we'd been to collect the carcass and whatever equipment we had left behind. I reluctantly agreed to go along with him for one trip back, as long as we weren't going to hunt. It took a few days before they'd let him go. The food we had left behind, including my uncle's beer, was ransacked. Probably the work of actual bears. The body of the wolf monster was gone, as luck would have it, either picked apart or carried away by another hunter. So to this day, the man tells the story about how he was nearly slain by the man-dog from hell, and how his quick reflexes were the only reason he's alive to this very day. He tells about how he had to calm me down while he was about to bleed out, so that I could drive him to the ER. I've stopped correcting him. It's his word against mine, and I'm the more sober of the two of us, so I figure anybody with any sense will understand that he's full of it. Back in the winter of 2010, so this would have been January, I stayed in a family-owned cabin for the entirety of the winter. This was up in the mountains of Colorado. I won't tell the area because I want to keep it private, but I can tell you that you get a lot of snow on average, so it's kind of more of a matter of survival sometimes. I prepared beforehand and packed as much supplies as I could, just to see if I could last all winter long, which I managed to, living off the bare necessities and while not starving, surviving, just to see if I could put myself through it and survive. I am no stranger to survival challenges, and this is just one of many that I've done. But I'm not writing to you to boast about my survival skills or my adventures, because during this time, January into early March, something much more grand took place around the cabin that I was at, which, by the way, is very desolate and very remote. There's nobody around, not a soul for miles and miles. It's even quite a trek to get up here, and as soon as snow comes, well, consider yourself lucky if you can make it. A snowmobile was pretty much all I had to get around, and that was when weather permitted. Before doing this challenge, my family regularly keeps up on the cabin, interior, exterior, roofing, and there's always ample amount of wood to use for a fire, so I never had to go out and split my own. Thank goodness. But the woodshed, which held tons and tons of wood, I don't even know how many cords, but more than I could count, was housed just about 100 feet away from the cabin, which meant I daily had to make trips to and from just to keep the cabin warm, and I did all my cooking on the wood stove, which required heat and required wood. It was sometime early January, and I want to say it was evening time. I can tell you it was already dark, so who really knows, because the sun sets at about 4:30ish. I was cooking a stew, I believe, when I began to hear horrible screaming coming from outside. I ran to the window and looked. I couldn't see anything, even though it was lightly snowing. It sounded like bestial screams hollering back and forth. It was bizarre. Imagine hearing the sounds of two dinosaurs fighting, or giants fighting. It sounded absolutely vicious. I have no other words to describe it. The noises went on for quite some time, maybe about 10 to 20 minutes, on and off. I never saw what made the noise, but it sounded like an absolute war zone. Screams, cries, bangs, like something hard hitting a tree. I began to wonder if I was going crazy, or I was genuinely hearing two Tyrannosaurus Rexes duking it out in the middle of the Colorado mountains. Well, it eventually stopped, and I can't quite remember if it was the following morning or the morning after the following day, where I went out to go get some wood for the fire, and standing not too far on the hillside was a tall human-like shape that looked very scrawny and unkempt from the waist down, but had huge overly sized shoulders and large antlers, kind of like caribou do. But because of the distance and where the sun was positioned in the sky, it appeared to be mainly a silhouette. It made me stop in my tracks, and I thought somebody, maybe an indigenous native or somebody, was out here, covered in animal skins. But it didn't look right. It didn't look exactly human, and it was way taller than that of a person. After studying this figure for a moment, I dismissed it, went and grabbed a nice bundle of wood, and as I'm walking back to the cabin, just glanced over my shoulder out of curiosity to see if this figure was still there, or perhaps had moved closer, when in reality, the figure was now gone. Where the figure was standing, even though it was on a hillside, there's no way it could have moved that fast to be completely concealed against the white backdrop of the snowy mountains. I didn't think much of this. It was a little startling, but maybe I was just starting to become stir-crazy. My eyes were just playing tricks on me, I assumed. The day went on as normal, and for the next few days, I began to feel a growing sensation that I wasn't alone, that there were others around me. Maybe people, maybe something more. I couldn't describe it. Then, that feeling began to turn into worry, and finally into danger, in just a matter of 3 to 4 days, as I felt whatever this energy or force was closing in on me. But yet, after looking around, looking out the windows constantly, in fear that something, or multiple things were coming after me, there was nothing. Nothing but the beautiful backdrop of snow and the clear, crystal clear air of the mountains. I'd be lying if I said I didn't have bouts of insanity, or at least where I think I was insane. Maybe this was my shining moment, like the movie, where the dad begins to just lose it. Maybe there was something about this cabin. Those fears and thoughts were quickly put to rest by what happened shortly after this. Directly down south from the cabin, down the hillside, is a large aspen tree, separated from the others. I took a step out one afternoon, just to catch some breath air, thinking I was literally going insane, when my eyes caught something that didn't quite make sense. It was a head, peering out from behind the tree, trying to remain concealed, but clearly visible from my standpoint. I don't think whoever or whatever this was realized I could see it, because it stood out like a sore thumb. It's what I saw that didn't make sense. The head that was looking at me wasn't that of a person, like you're probably expecting it to be, and it did not have antlers. It was the black head of a very large canine, except it was higher up from the ground than I can stand, meaning that the possibility of this or person being bipedal, which is why at first I assumed it was a person, was all the now real. I couldn't see any eyes or any discernible features, just the shape of a large dog. Maybe a Doberman Pinscher, as far as shape relating to the silhouette. But whatever or whoever it was very visibly watching me from behind this large aspen tree, maybe about 150 yards downhill. It kinda creeped me out. Now, I knew I wasn't crazy. I had to think of what I can do. I went back inside the cabin, kept the door locked, and now I had to be much more methodical about when I got wood and how I got wood. Was I even safe? I always kept a machete on me, just in case. Not necessarily to fight off bears or anything, but it's always good to have when you go into the wild, even though I would be staying in a cabin for the majority of the winter. It was this moment, right after I came inside, that I realized my insanity wasn't necessarily my insanity, that there really was something afoot. Now, after seeing the gaunt figure with huge caribou antlers and this large Doberman Pinscher dog head not far off down the hill, what was happening? I contemplated this the rest of the night, and it very much disturbed me. And it was that night, I do remember, that I was awoken by something very large walking through the snow around the cabin, tapping ever so lightly against the wood, like it had nails, and it was just slowly dragging them. And sometimes I would hear grunts and snorts and sniffing, keeping me awake the entire night, because I'm a fairly light sleeper, and this just didn't allow me to fall into a deep REM sleep like I needed. So every time I would hear the slightest noise, I would hear this thing walking around all night long. I think this night was when I began to feel the pinnacle of my emotions, that I was truly in danger, and I was indeed being stalked by some horrendous, crazy mountain predator that I didn't even know existed. I couldn't ignore this anymore. This wasn't just somebody hunting me in a costume, or some crazy lunatic you'd expect to see in a movie with an axe. This was far beyond anything of my comprehension, and unfortunately, my story gets worse. The next morning, I remained pretty paranoid after the events of last night and the previous day. I wasn't exactly sure what to do, but I had to get wood and maintain heat to cook and survive if I didn't want to die of cold. I kept my machete on me at all times, constantly glancing over my shoulder, looking around me, acting like a paranoid schizophrenic. I wasn't exactly sure what this next day would bring, but fortunately, at least until about 3 p.m. in the afternoon, nothing. The other creepy thing is, when I tried to scout around the cabin to see where this large shape or thing was walking around the night before, sniffing and grunting, right where I heard it tapping against the walls, there was no point in looking for any tracks, because it had continuously snowed throughout the night, covering any evidence that there would ever be anything. Same thing with looking for tracks leading up to the cabin. The snow was fresh, and anything that would have remained was now buried and hidden. Fast forward to about 3 p.m. of that day, and while I hadn't had anything else happen since, this is where things began to get even more creepy. I started hearing my name being called from outside. Far away. I couldn't even begin to tell you the direction that I heard my name being called from. It sounded like it was coming from all around the cabin, and not just one direction, like a chorus of voices. And here's the eerie part. I was able to recognize each and every voice. Every single voice was the voice of dead relatives. My great-grandfather and great-grandmother, my great-uncle, and other relatives that have since long passed. I'm not exactly sure what was going on. Was I having a mental breakdown? Was being up here too much for my mind to handle? Was the isolation breaking my mind? Was I having severe altitude sickness? No, I was fine, up until I came here, up until the past few days, when all this began to happen. After the voices went on for probably 10 minutes, over and over, calling my name, telling me to follow, I stepped outside to see if I can pinpoint the direction from where this was coming from, when I saw the same original figure I did, on a different hillside, and about roughly the same distance as before, also just appearing as a dark silhouette, with no discernible real features. A skinny, gaunt figure that looked to be covered in animal skins, with very abnormally large shoulders, and a large head that appeared to be kind of like a caribou. I don't know if the head was like that, but the antlers were like that, where they're so oversized and huge, you can't even imagine how the head can keep those up. Now, I was going from psychotic to freaked out and paranoid, to terrified, scared, and gripping the machete that I kept at my side even tighter than I ever had before. Running back inside, I now deemed it not safe at all to be outside, period. And the only reason I should ever step foot out is to only ever get wood, and that was it. I made sure to close every curtain in the cabin, which there was only a few windows, so that wasn't a problem. Make sure both doors were locked, and stay low, hunker down, read, keep my mind as distracted as possible. But the noises, the voices, the haunting only ever persisted, worse than it ever has. As the evening progressed into nighttime, now I was hearing all sorts of disturbing noises, the sounds that had accompanied my cabin a few nights prior. The thing walking around, sniffing, grunting, like it was looking for a weak point to get in. Not to mention the ominous feelings, the voices of my dead relatives calling me, trying to lure me out of the cabin. And just as soon as it started, it all stopped, suddenly, sometime in the middle of the night. I had no idea why, or why the feelings and all the noises around me just suddenly went quiet. Then, maybe not even a moment later, noises began erupting off in the distance. That sound, like 2 Tyrannosaurus Rexes duking it out, was happening again. Only this time, it didn't sound like 2 giant reptiles fighting, like it had before. But that could have possibly just been because of the distortion of the distance and the ambiance of the environment around me. This sounded like beasts and demons fighting for their only meal. It was completely vicious in every sense of the word. I didn't even want to see what was happening, let alone hear it. It was just too frightening. It stopped after about an hour of ongoing racket, and then that was it. The rest of the night was dead silent. Nothing. You could barely even hear the breeze. I was too scared to even step outside to see if there had been anything that would cause the noise. Well, to be honest with you, I ended up cutting the trip shorter than expected, and instead of staying there all winter, like I would have hoped to, I decided it wasn't safe to be up here anymore. After this going on for maybe 5 or 6 days in total, I needed to leave and abandon my journey. The following day, as I'm getting all my supplies ready to hop on the snowmobile and make it down to semi-civilization, things reappeared for a final time. As I'm getting everything ready, I look up and I see that same gaunt figure with the caribou horns not far in the distance, on the same hillside as I originally saw it. Only this time, it was moving toward me, not moving its legs as if it were walking through snow, but as if it were gliding through the snow, as if there was no resistance and nothing to hold it back from getting to me. Now I was terrified. I got ready as quickly as I could, which I only had a few bags to put on. Once I started it, and I began moving at a fast speed, you're probably not going to believe this, but as I turned back, I saw at least 3 or 4 of these giant black Doberman Pinscher-looking wolves come out of nowhere, or from behind the trees, wherever they were concealed at, and jump and leap right toward this gaunt figure. I turned back to where I was going, and didn't want to watch what was about to ensue. The noises erupted again, of the same sounds that I had heard the night prior. The eruption of violence, like wild beasts fighting in the night. That's what I must have heard. 2 of these creatures, or demons, whatever they were fighting. I just remember thinking to myself on the way back down, I'm never coming back. This entire mountain, this entire place is cursed. With what? I don't know, but I never want to show up back here again. After speaking to my family, shortly after this stint, I pulled a few family members aside and spoke to them in private about what exactly I encountered going up there, thinking it was just some crazy hallucinations of being isolated. But in reality, I told them that my fears became nightmares as what I saw manifested into actual things that were the cause of my fears. They could do nothing but look down, remain quiet, while some of them told me they knew well that these things were up there, and that's part of the reason why they never went out there themselves. For whatever reason, keeping it from me, as if I would mock them, ridicule them, or for whatever reason I'm not sure. But I can thoroughly say that hands down, my little stint of survival up there in that cabin was easily the scariest moments of my life that I've ever experienced.